The seventh chapter of our textbook is entitled The Provider God. We see in Scripture that God is called the God of love. He is love. He is described as having everlasting love. He is described as the God of loving kindness. He is the God who shows love to Israel. He is the God of love. He is love to the church. God's love, which cannot be seen, like the rest of the attributes of God, is something that He wants us to understand. We can't see it, so how does He demonstrate or illustrate His love to us? He puts physical illustrations of His love in the creation. Now, it turns out that God's love can be demonstrated in a variety of ways. In a previous chapter, we have already talked about how love can be expressed in relationship, in helping others in a direct sense. In this particular chapter, we're going to look at a different way in which love is in fact illustrated, and that is by providing for the needs of another being. And in this particular case, we're talking about providing for the needs of the physical creation long before they're needed, to anticipate the needs of the creation and to fulfill those needs before the organisms that need them will even come into existence. Basically, these are examples of ways in which God provided for the organisms of His planet that He will create in the original creation long before those organisms came to be. And He did this, or at least it comes to our attention that He has done this through something called the Anthropic principle. Anthropic is derived from the word anthros, meaning man. Basically, it just means the man principle. What is the man principle? Well, the man principle, put simply, says it looks like the universe was made for man, with man in mind. Now, it's interesting to note that the Anthropic principle was observed, postulated, and proposed, first of all, not by people who actually believed that the universe was made by man, but by folks who were predisposed to think that there was no creator, that in fact the universe was not created for man. This is very interesting. People would look at the universe and say, it sure does look like the universe was made for man, even though they personally, most of them, did not believe that the universe was created for man. This is impressive to me. It suggests that these characteristics of the universe are so profound, are so impressive, that even those who don't want to believe that the universe was made for man, in fact believe that it looks like the universe was made for man. Put a different way, the universe could have been different than the way it is. It could have been created or come to be with a different set of characteristics than characterize the universe in the present. But the way it happens to be right now is very convenient. Of all the possible ways that the universe could be, the way it actually is convenient for humans. The Anthropic principle is a rather large topic. Many things, many characteristics of the universe have been pointed to as evidences of the basic Anthropic principle. We're going to consider a number of these evidences in categories. I'm going to introduce a category of evidence for the Anthropic principle, explain what that category of evidence is, and then give an example or two from each of those categories. I am not going to go through every single example. There are many of them in the universe, but I'm going to give you a flavor of the various types of Anthropic principle evidences and examples in each of these cases. We're also going to consider them in two major categories. You can divide the anthropic principle characteristics into first those that seem to be necessary for our existence, and then a set of anthropic principle characteristics that don't seem to be necessary for our existence. It turns out this second category is perhaps more interesting than the first. I'm going to reserve that for later in our discussion, for the end of the chapter. I will begin the chapter by looking through categories of evidence that it looks like the universe is designed a very special way so that humans could exist, or in general, so that life could exist. Things that had to be the case for life to exist in this universe. And what I'm going to do in that category of necessary anthropic principle characteristics, those necessary for life, I'm going to group them into categories beginning with things that are describing the Earth itself, and then we're going to move to bigger things like the solar system, and then we're going to move to bigger things like galaxies and ultimately the universe. Then we're going to back down to small things and work our way back up to the size of human beings. So we're going to begin here. The first category, and the one we're going to deal with in this particular session, are those anthropic principle characteristics of the Earth that are necessary or seem to be necessary for life itself. First of all, we have the mass of the Earth itself, how heavy the Earth is, how much matter is in the Earth. If there was much less mass on the Earth, it would have less gravity. If it had less gravity, it would not be able to hold onto its surface as much as it currently does. If it had too much less gas, or too much less gravity, it would hold much less gas than it does now. There's a number of types of gas that are held onto the Earth at present, because the Earth is big enough to do so, that would have floated off into space, those gases being absolutely necessary for our existence. In particular, if the mass of the Earth was significantly less than it is now, it wouldn't hold what we call greenhouse gases. These are triatomic gases, gases that are made of 3 atoms, like H2O, 2 hydrogens of hydrogen, 2 atoms of hydrogen and 1 atom of oxygen in 1 molecule, triatomic, 3 atoms. Or carbon dioxide, 1 atom of carbon, 2 atoms of oxygen for a total of 3 atoms. Or ozone, O3, 3 atoms of ozone. Or in the case of methane, CH4, that's a molecule that's made of 5 atoms. These are heavier molecules. They are held in place on the Earth, in the Earth's atmosphere by the gravity of the Earth. But if the Earth's gravity was much less, these things would have wandered off into space. They wouldn't be held onto the Earth. Why are these important? Because these polyatomic, triatomic molecules like water, carbon dioxide, and ozone absorb light from the sun and keep the surface of the Earth significantly warmer than it would otherwise be if these gases weren't there. You see, the temperature of things outside the Earth is really cold. You get outside the Earth and the temperature is more than 200 degrees below 0 centigrade. It's like hundreds, 400 or 500 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. It is impossibly cold out there. This Earth is kept nicely warm on its surface, but outside the Earth, it is impossibly cold. How is it that the Earth is kept so warm? It's largely the consequence of tri-polyatomic molecules. And those are held in place because the mass of the Earth is just right to hold them in. But if the mass of the Earth was much larger than it is now, it would hold these greenhouse gases, but it would also hold some additional gases that currently aren't held by the Earth that turn out to be poisonous. Such gases as hydrogen. Two atoms of hydrogen together make hydrogen gas, which is poisonous. helium gas, which is poisonous. Right now, with the current mass of the Earth, they're so light that they eventually make their way out of the atmosphere. They don't accumulate in the atmosphere, so the atmosphere is not poisonous. So the mass of the Earth seems to be just right to allow for just the right kind of atmosphere that is warm enough to supply life, but which doesn't have poisonous gases. A second AP characteristic, anthropic principal characteristic of the Earth, is the tilt of the Earth's axis, and in fact the distribution of water and continents on the surface. It turns out that this strange, some people look at it and think, well, this doesn't seem right. It seems like symmetry would say that the axis of the Earth should be vertical, the Earth should spin along a vertical axis, and that would look prettier as the Earth went around the sun. It turns out if you did that, however, the sunlight would always hit the equator of the Earth and be very thin on the poles of the Earth, create an enormous temperature difference between the pole and the equator, so much of a difference that life really wouldn't be possible on either the equator or the poles. Too cold on the poles, too hot on the equator. It'd be difficult for life to exist anywhere. And the storms that would occur in between, trying to equalize this temperature difference, would make life probably impossible on the Earth. But this 23.5 degree tilt of the Earth as the Earth goes around the sun is such that the sun actually beams down directly at different latitudes around the planet as the planet goes around the sun, and thus spreads out the temperature, doesn't heat up the equator too hot, and doesn't cause the poles to become too cold. So it turns out that axis of the Earth seems to be necessary, that tilt, which might not look, aesthetically pleasing to some people, turns out to be an extraordinary design. It's as if the Earth was put at exactly the right tilt to allow life to persist on the planet. And we have an additional issue of the fact that 70% of the Earth's surface is covered with ocean. Only 30% is covered with continents. And there's a strange distribution of continents. There's a big ocean on one side, the Pacific Ocean, much smaller oceans on the other side. People who have the time to work these things out and work out models have realized, you know what? That very strange distribution of continents and oceans may be absolutely necessary for the life that we have on the planet, especially this ratio of 70% water to 30% land. Water, it turns out, holds a lot of heat, doesn't release it as quickly as the heat is released by the land. And so as a consequence, this temperature problem, the heat that is needed from the sun to keep the Earth at a warm temperature is better kept there, not just by these greenhouse gases, but by having a lot of ocean. It holds the heat in such a way as to even the heat out. And it looks like the distribution of continents, as strange as they are, is just right to even out temperatures to make life possible on this planet. A third AP characteristic of the Earth is something we call the water cycle. Based upon the shape of the continents, the mass, and the temperature of the Earth, we have a temperature on the surface of the Earth that keeps water most of the time in its liquid form. And water it gets cold enough in some places on the Earth for water to turn into its solid form. And it's not so cold as to prevent water from also being able to precipitate, to evaporate into the atmosphere, take on its gaseous form, which allows water to evaporate into the atmosphere, move in over places that need water, like the continents, cool, and drop the gaseous water in the form of liquid water, rain, over the continents, and run back into the oceans and repeat this process. This cycle of evaporation, condensation, precipitation, and runoff back to the ocean provides water to every place, or most every place, on the planet Earth. This is really cool because it turns out that all organisms, we're going to get to this in future chapters, all organisms need water. And so we need organisms to be watered somehow. We need the water to get there. The water cycle allows for water to be distributed around the world, even long distances away from the oceans. In fact, this water cycle concept was recognized by the writer of Ecclesiastes. Notice the words in Ecclesiastes 1:7. All the rivers run into the sea, continually do so. It's amazing to stand at the mouth of a river for a long time and realize this water is pouring into the ocean and keeps doing so all day long, all night long, every day, every week, for years and years and years. It's pouring water into the ocean, yet the sea is not full. The sea doesn't overrun the land. So it says, how do you explain this? Well, unto the place from whence the rivers came, thither they return again. So the concept here, the writer of Ecclesiastes recognizes that the water leaves the oceans, goes into the atmosphere, comes back down as rain, and flows back into the oceans, creating a water cycle. And that water cycle is absolutely necessary for life on the earth. Another AP characteristic of the earth is the interesting chemical composition of the atmosphere. There is a particular set of gases that are found in the atmosphere. 78% of the atmosphere is nitrogen gas. 21% is oxygen. Leaving, you can add that together, 78 plus 21 gives you 99%. That's almost all the gas of the atmosphere right there in just two of them, nitrogen and oxygen. There's about 0.3% carbon dioxide in the atmosphere of the Earth. And then there's some ozone in the atmosphere, and then other gases at very, very low concentrations. This particular mixture, 78% nitrogen, 21% oxygen, turns out to be, well, it's kind of uncannily like it was designed that way. You might think that with animals on the surface that need oxygen, wouldn't it be better to just give them a pure oxygen atmosphere? I mean, if people are ill or older, we give them oxygen tanks to in fact breathe in more oxygen. Wouldn't it be better? Well, we sort of experimented with that. It wasn't exactly an experiment. We thought that was a better way to supply the oxygen for astronauts early on in the space in the space program, for the Mercury, for the early Apollo missions. We filled the compartment where the astronauts lived or resided there with oxygen, pure oxygen. It turns out to have some health benefits, but alas, Apollo 8, I believe it was, a spark in that compartment ignited the oxygen and burned up the 3 astronauts on the launch pad. We recognized it's unfortunately not a good idea to have a pure oxygen atmosphere. If you have too much oxygen, forest fires will continue to burn without control. You cannot put them out. And if you have too much oxygen, the whole atmosphere burns. We learned that in the Apollo mission. And we followed that up by changing the atmospheric composition and realized, upon playing with it up and down, that something like a little better than 3/4 of the atmosphere being nitrogen and a little less than 1/4 of it being oxygen turns out to be the perfect ratio. If you have too little oxygen, of course, the animals can't breathe. If you have too much oxygen, you have this problem of forest fires or fires of the atmosphere. And the reason nitrogen is a good thing to throw in there is because nitrogen doesn't react in most chemical reactions. It doesn't involve itself in most fires It will not chemically react with anything, so it doesn't burn. It doesn't mess up other chemical reactions. And yet, with having it in there, it dilutes the oxygen enough so that oxygen doesn't create fires out of control, and it increases the amount of gas and thus pressure in the atmosphere, helping animals breathe oxygen, so it increases the pressure of oxygen to go into the blood of animals, which is a good thing. It increases the pressure of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere so that plants have an easier time pulling in carbon dioxide. Wow, it's a really cool design. The carbon dioxide, of course, is good so that plants can take the carbon dioxide in and produce food. But it's not so much carbon dioxide that the atmosphere of the Earth is will in fact heat up too much. Because remember, carbon dioxide is a triatomic molecule. It has 3 atoms rather than 2 in its molecular configuration. It tends to take in heat from the sun, warming the surface of the Earth. If you have too much carbon dioxide, the surface of the Earth gets too warm. For example, Venus, which is almost exactly the same size as the Earth, just a little difference in size, a little difference in mass. It's basically a twin of the Earth. It does orbit the sun a little closer to the sun, but the really big difference between Venus and the Earth is it's got a very high carbon dioxide content. As a consequence, the surface of Venus is 400 degrees centigrade. It melts lead on the surface. It is much too hot for life. And so this is the problem with having too much carbon dioxide. So the atmospheric composition with only having 0.3% carbon dioxide turns out to be just right for life on the Earth. And then we have this ozone listed here. With 21% oxygen, there's a certain very low percentage of ozone which is associated with it. That ozone does 2 things. It is a triatomic molecule that helps warm the Earth, but at the same time it also absorbs ultraviolet radiation from the sun, protecting us from our skin getting burnt more than it does. It's a shield or a block of radiation. So it both warms the Earth and shields us from radiation. This is an amazing mixture of gases. It seems like it was designed with man in mind so that we could survive in the world that we now live in. Another characteristic of the Earth is its magnetic field. Because of a very odd, characteristic of the Earth, the surface rocks of the Earth don't characterize the entire Earth. The inside of the Earth is made of a very different substance, mainly nickel and iron, a substance that can conduct electricity rather readily, electricity that's running around in the outer core of the Earth and producing a magnetic field of the Earth. Thus, a compass is drawn to the north magnetic field of the Earth because the Earth has a magnetic field. That magnetic field is useful. Among other things, it deflects harmful radiation from space that has electrical charges. Things from the sun or other places that have electrical charges coming into the Earth that could do us damage are caught in the Earth's magnetic field and spiraled towards the poles and brought down to the poles rather than being directly shined down upon us. Since most people don't live on the poles, that has deflected harmful radiation away from humans. It creates, as those particles come into the atmosphere, the beautiful northern lights or southern lights. That's evidence of the magnetic field, which is always out there protecting us. It's really cool to have it. Not all bodies of the universe, not all solar system bodies have magnetic fields. The moon doesn't have a magnetic field, but the Earth has the kind of magnetic field it needs to protect us from harmful radiation. So these very special characteristics of the Earth seem to be designed with man in mind, with humans in mind, with life in mind. It's as if somebody specially designed the Earth to, in fact, be ready for life before life came to be. This is something that's easily explained by a God who anticipating the need for animals and humans, created the earth in such a way as to meet those needs long before those things were created.